Today I'm going to be talking about a theory you've never heard of, and hopefully by the end of it you'll think, as I do, that it really is something that nobody really talks about, and yet it has changed the world and continues to change the world. It's called the Hamitic hypothesis. It's an idea that developed over hundreds of years, became very popular in the 19th century, but continues to affect parts of the world today, particularly Africa. It's the subject of a book that I've written that'll be coming out in a couple of months called The Lost White Tribe: Explorers, Scientists, and a Theory That Changed a Continent. This story, well, I should tell you, I'm a historian of exploration, and that's my job. I look at explorers and expeditions and cultural encounters with people around the world and why people think these expeditions are so important back home. And this story of the Lost White Tribe, which I'm going to be talking about, and the Hamitic hypothesis, really grew out of a book I wrote about 10 years ago called The Coldest Crucible. And that was about Arctic exploration. And in a way, I never would have imagined that this book about the Arctic would have led me to the project I'm working on now, because this book is about the Arctic, and the Hamitic hypothesis is really about Africa. But it actually grew out of part of that earlier topic. I was writing about Arctic exploration. I was particularly interested in American explorers and how in the 1800s American explorers found it so interesting to go to the Arctic, a really dangerous place. Many dozens of Americans lost their lives going there, either to try to find a Northwest Passage or to get to the North Pole. But I found this story of one explorer. His name was Vilhjalmur Stefansson. And he went to the Arctic not to try to get to the North Pole, but to find undiscovered peoples. And while he was in the upper region of Canada, in a place called Victoria Island, he discovered a group of Inuit, which he described when he came back as being blonde, of being what he called blonde Eskimos. And I thought this was the most bizarre story, but I couldn't stop reading about it. There were stories all over the United States at the time. In fact, worldwide press took up the story of the blonde Eskimos of Victoria Island. Some people thought it was a complete fake, that it was a hoax. Other people thought it was an amazing kind of discovery that needed to be explained. But I had nothing that I could do with it. It had no part to play in the story I was telling. So I tucked it away in a file. And what I found was that over the next 6 years or so, I started finding more and more kind of stories of these tribes, these white tribes that people had discovered all over the world. So for example, in Panama, Richard Marsh finds a group that he calls the White Indians. And in Central Asia, there's a group of people who said they found Tibetans who looked Aryan. And in parts of Africa, people were finding white tribes as well. And in Japan, people discovered in the late 19th century a group called the Ainu in the northern island of Japan, which they said looked like Caucasians. So by the time I got to about 2008, I had this giant file of kind of weird white tribe discoveries, and I figured now was the time to do something with it. But there was one story in particular that I was interested in, and that was the story of a discovery that took place in East Africa in the 1870s. In that red box that you see there. It happened just to the west of Lake Victoria, one of the largest lakes in the world. And it was made by a very famous explorer, Henry Morton Stanley. Now, Stanley may be familiar to you as the guy who discovers Livingstone, or rescues Livingstone, in the heart of Africa in 1869. In fact, the phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," was supposedly something that Stanley said to Livingstone when they met. This was one of the most famous expeditions of the 19th century. But Stanley went back to Africa. He went back many times. And on his subsequent expedition to Africa, he went not to find Livingstone, but to try to discover the source of the Nile. People knew by the late 1800s that there were many lakes in the areas of East Africa, what we call the Rift Valley of East Africa, and that one of these lakes would have been the source of the Nile, something that geographers had been searching for 2,000 years. But Stanley said, I'm going to figure out which of these lakes it actually is. And so he treks into East Africa, and he determines with great confidence that Lake Victoria is the ultimate source of the Nile. 4,000 miles of Nile River, and that is the source. But what he also discovers is something that, in a sense, creates a new mystery, which is he finds that there are members of an African soldier force that are protecting him, which look white. And he calls them Greeks in white shirts. He can't believe how light-complected these Africans are. He asks other members of his expedition party, who are these men? And they say, they come from the mountains to the west on a mountain called Gambara. So he writes about this and sends these reports back home. And the illustrations of his narrative actually show Mount Gambara over on the left-hand side of the illustration. You can see it in the background. This became a huge story back home, this lost white race that Stanley had found in the heart of Africa. Now, how in God's name would Stanley have explained this in the late 18th century? What kind of theoretical background could people use, or information, why you would find a group of white people living in the heart of Africa? In fact, Stanley, very much as a man of the 1800s, was at this transition moment between people who used the Bible as a way of explaining the history of the world and people who used science as a way of explaining the history of the world. And
so this video will be about what kind of distortions of the history could have led to such a terrible misunderstanding. And that's why we'll try to go as far as possible back in the Japanese history, before the Asian race populated the islands.
Back then, they were completely different creatures. And completely different people. Long before the arrival of the Asian race on the Japanese islands, the local inhabitants were Caucasian people, the Aino people. As of today, the Aino people are almost completely blended with the Asian race and have lost almost completely their ethnic identity. But there are still some clues of their traditional philosophy and their view of life, and those point towards a clear connection with the culture which we call the culture of the survivors, a worldwide civilization or a group of people which sent its representatives worldwide to blend in with the simple local people. And that's why the views of the Ainos, philosophy, cosmology, dharma, and everything else, is exactly like that of other native people who live many thousands of kilometers away. The fact that the original inhabitants of the island were Caucasian is not denied in Japan, as they try to do in China and Siberia, where they killed them all a long time ago. And when Caucasian mummies of very tall people are being dug up, they pretend as if nothing happened and they don't change the history of the regions. So in Japan, somehow the Ainos survived, but still not enough research is done to determine their real place in history, because that will trigger the revelations about how and why the population of such a vast area, which includes Siberia, Central Asia, China, and so on, so that the purpose of erasing the memory about the culture of the survivors, the official historians are not encouraged to delve much into the real history of the indigenous people. Instead, they always give very superficial information about the latest inhabitants, the current inhabitants, and they tried to create the impression that they were the only inhabitants ever there. And in terms of the concepts of various waves of survivors, a concept that we reviewed in the episode about America, it seems that the Aino belong towards the earlier waves that we know of. Now, let's see a bit more about the last wave.
These were men, the last who remained alive from the defeated army of the last nation, which refused to accept the rule of the parasitic forces, which kept the records of the real history of the human races, and which, as we're gonna see in the next episode about China, still had some of the abilities that now we call supernatural. Of course, for them they were natural. And they had those abilities because of the connection with Hyperborea, which probably was one of the cultures or civilizations which served as a basis for the legend of what we call now collectively Atlantis. A land in the East, where the influence of the survivors' culture was always stronger. And that's why the Ainu were not completely exterminated over there back then, as was the case in Siberia and Central Asia. Even according to the official history of Japan at that time, the country was greatly influenced by the so-called Rusui, which sounds very similar to Rusi, which not so long time ago in the Slavic languages was used to point towards the people of what we call Russia nowadays. Even in the Latin languages, the connection is still clear, Russi, Russians. And as we are gonna see in the future episodes, these Russi were fleeing their own land, because what we call nowadays Russia is not as old as they want us to think, and it was artificially created, so to say, to replace another country, the biggest on earth, and yet a country that you will not find even a single sentence about in your standard history.
Основные жители Марокко не арабы, а мазахи, греческое – берберы. Откуда племена этих светлокожих, худощавых, высоких мужчин и изящных, красивых женщин появились когда-то в Африке, до сих пор неизвестно. Но случилось это за много сотен лет до того, как эти земли завоевали арабы, и даже до прихода финикийцев. Сейчас многие амазахи ассимилировали с местным населением арабской или африканской внешности, но осталось и немало чистых представителей. Известные люди амазахского происхождения – Зиндан Зинедин, Изабель Аджани. Берберы от греческого барбары, самоназвание Амазах, господарь, свободный, благородный человек. Общее название коренных жителей Северной Африки от Египта на востоке до Атлантического океана на западе и от Судана на юге до Средиземного моря на севере, говорят на берберских языках. По религии сейчас в основном мусульмане-сунниты, но сохранили целый ряд этнических обычаев. Название берберы, данное европейцами по аналогии с варварами из-за непонятности их языка. Спорно, но весьма вероятно родство и берберов, и гуначей. В средние века туареги были заняты в транссахарской торговле, создали несколько просуществовавших недолго государственных образований, такие как султанат Агадес. Контролировали важные первоначальные торговые пункты, как, например, Такедда, город-государство на территории Нигера, в оазисе на западе Нагорья Аир, существовавшее в средние века. Во время колониальной эры туареги оказались включены во французскую Западную Африку. В отличие от многих других народов, туареги на протяжении долгого времени
فشوري بان ما ذكتنا غذنا كيني ثورة ميض بضاث مادي يرزق ضادوني نكي ذا سورنا مسفان.
A young woman born to Indian parents with red hair, white skin and freckles has spent her life being shunned and bullied because people think she's diseased. Pooya Ganatra, 24, who was born in Mumbai, has flaming ginger hair, deep emerald eyes and white skin, like that of a stereotypical Gaelic woman.
小巷端有谁怜？桃李明年能再发，明年闺中只有谁？花魂鸟魂总难留，鸟自无语花自羞。愿无泪下身上衣，随花飞到天尽头。弄尽残花人笑痴，他年苍老却是谁？一朝春